Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper. Take a look at the important articles relevant either for your prelims or for your mains examination. And along the way, as we discuss these topics, we shall also be discussing the nuances of answer writing with the help of two practice questions, subjective type questions, which I expect you to be able to write thereafter and improve your answer writing skills. After this entire analysis, I also suggest you to do visit our Telegram page, the Telegram channel, and attempt the multiple choice questions which can be framed from this particular topic and aim to ace all the multiple choice questions so that you are well prepared for the prelims as well. Now, having said that, before we take a look into the topics, an important announcement with regards to the offer. So basically, owing to and recognizing the needs of the candidates, we have brought for you an extraordinary offer in order to provide the holistic preparation at a very affordable rate. And today marks the last day of that particular offer, where you can avail the entire course at a figure of 24,999. With this, you get access to the top quality lectures from the top educators of the country, the various different test series, lectures with the PPTs, and one-to-one doubt resolution as well. In case you are interested in appearing for the examination next year or even year after that, you'll find a form provided in the link description below. Do fill out that form and the details in that form, and that will help you take a next step in acing your preparation. Now, without further ado, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So today in total, we are going to cover close to around 10 topics. The world needs blue helmets who act as blue helmets. Now, this is about the UN peacekeeping force and the need for having an active UN peacekeeping force and utilizing them in various different theaters of conflict. This has appeared in the editorial section. We are going to talk about that. Working towards a meaningful victims register in Bastar. In the left-wing extremist impacted areas, there is a requirement of a victims register. What is that? Now, over the borderline, this basically is a follow-up story to the kind of disengagement which has been attained and achieved between India and China, and what needs to be done going ahead in order to instill faith of the larger population. The job crisis undermines the state legitimacy. This is about the quality of jobs and the lack of jobs, in fact, in our country and in various different countries also, due to which the entire faith in the political system, the entire faith in the democratic process, that can be put at risk. Now, why are big tech companies scouting for nuclear power as Google arrives at a deal with one of the small modular reactor companies? Now, what is the need that these companies, when we talk about tech companies, why do they need to get nuclear power? So these are some of the topics we are going to discuss in detail. Now, the first topic is relevant for your GS paper 2. Then after that, working towards a meaningful victims register. This is relevant for GS2 as well as GS3. Okay. Over the borderline, again, relevant for your GS paper 2. The job crisis, this is relevant for your GS3, and so is the last topic. So overall, these are the various different conceptual areas that we are going to cover, and some of the topics relevant for the prelims also, we are going to take a look and understand them going along the way. So starting with the first topic of the day, and that is the world needs blue helmets who act as blue helmets. Now here, when we refer to blue helmets, or when this particular article deals with the blue helmets as a terminology, it is basically referring to the UN peacekeeping force. Now, the UN peacekeeping force, the ideation behind it was to provide that necessary force whenever required in order to provide and bring about peace in conflict-ridden areas. Now, this has been a setup post Second World War. As you know, UN as an international governing agency or body came into establishment after the Second World War in order to maintain the world peace and to ensure that the globe doesn't, or the planet doesn't, descend into another level of large-scale war. Now, in the present day condition, when we see a war going on for almost 2.5 years to almost 3 years in the region of Russia and Ukraine, and a war in the region of Middle East, that is between Israel and Hamas, and now that war spilling over to Lebanon and Iran, that has been going on for more than a year. The article questions the lack of utilization or a complete absence of the UN peacekeeping force. Now, why is it so? That erodes the basic trust that members of the global polity and the global committee of nations have in the very relevance of United Nations. Now here, the UN Charter in itself deals with the importance of having peace amongst the member nations. And you have the Chapter 6, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which talk about why and how to instill peace. If you take a look at the relevant UN charters associated with that, so the Chapter 6 of the UN Charter talks about encouragement to the member nations to come across a peaceful settlement of disputes. Right? Whenever two member nations have any kind of dispute, they should always be encouraged to come across a peaceful settlement. But in case that is not achieved, the member nations are unable to achieve that peace, then Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, they take precedence, or they are the norms to be followed. So what are they? So Chapter 7 enables the Security Council to take coercive action whenever required with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace and acts of aggression. Exhorts member nations and member states to make available such military or police force as may be required to establish peace. So this is the provision under this is utilized whereby various different member nations, they provide or they basically depute members of the armed forces, members of the police forces to work on deputation as UN peacekeeping force, right? Then Chapter 8 talks about robust regional arrangement in enforcing peace upon authorization by the Security Council. So all these chapters, they basically talk about that UN peacekeeping force should be there, and if required, if peaceful settlement is not agreed upon, then that peacekeeping force should be deployed in order to maintain peace. Now, UN has got a very large peacekeeping force. India is amongst the largest contributors to the peacekeeping force. Now, close to around 1 lakh personnel who serve under UN peacekeeping force at any point of time, they are deployed in various parts of the world, mostly in the regions of Africa, but otherwise also historically, they have been deployed in various different areas to attain peace. Now, wherever they have been deployed, they have achieved significant amount of success. But there are a couple of instances where the UN has remained a mere bystander. And this is what the article focuses upon. The problems of being a bystander. Bystander means what? Someone who was present at the time when the event was unfolding, but chose to do nothing. That is a bystander. So a bystander oftentimes is also as guilty, if not more, in the perpetration of any particular crime. So here, if you observe, then UN peacekeeping force, they were deployed in Cambodia, Mozambique, Kosovo, Timor-Leste, Angola, Sierra Leone and Liberia, where they achieved considerable amount of success. But the UN peacekeeping force remained as a bystander in Rwanda in 1994, when you had millions of Tutsi civilians who were basically killed in what can be termed as one of the worst genocides. And why this happened? This was because as the genocide unfolded in Rwanda, one of the Security Council members, that is France, continued to lend its support to the army in Rwanda. So here, in the entire charter, you will find that the use and the importance of Security Council is significant. One of the Security Council states, if they don't perform the role of maintaining the global peace and taking a partisan side, you can have the events unfolding what happened in Rwanda or even in Bosnia in the year immediately afterwards. 1994 and 1995. Across the globe, millions of lives were lost. And what can be termed in a very moderate term as a genocide. So when we talk about the ongoing conflicts in the region of Russia, Ukraine, in the region of Israel and Hamas, Lebanon, in that particular area, this UN peacekeeping force should have been deployed. And that should have been maintained, that presence of UN peacekeeping force should have maintained a kind of a buffer between the two warring factions. That is what the article argues. It is a different matter altogether that this peacekeeping force, what is the respect that they are left with? Is it not also the case, or would it not have been the case, that if you deploy the UN peacekeeping force at the Russia-Ukraine border, the Russian army would have taken a look at it as a kind of imposition from the Western forces and the Western powers? Same in the case of Israel and Lebanon and Israel and Hamas conflict. Now, that is where there has been an urgent need to carry out reforms in the United Nations. Otherwise, all that lofty buildings that we have across the entire world under the realm of United Nations, what is the purpose of it? What is the use of it? Those large real estate, in fact, can be used by other NGOs which are more active. Because if you take a look at the trust level that the UN has in the present day and age, it is being eroded every particular day with every conflict which comes into existence. So that is where there is a need for reform. So what are the kind of reforms which are urgently required? First is the expansion of the Security Council. Now, this is something that India has been voicing along for almost now 2 decades, that Security Council needs to be reformed. The Security Council represents a post-Second World War order, which is not the reality in the 21st century. And the third decade of the 21st century, the reality could not have been more different. You have powers like India. You have powers like South Africa, which is a representative of the African nations. You have no representatives from South America. So unless and until you bring about an equal representation, why will people at all trust the UN Security Council? So that is why that reform is very urgently needed. Otherwise, the trust is anyways being eroded. And what we are observing is the rise of various different multilateral organizations which are replacing the role of UN. You have more relevance being paid to BRICS, you have more relevance being paid to SCO, more relevance being paid to other such formations. NATO, for example, is much more relevant to the Western powers as compared to what the UN says. So, in order to maintain trust, this is required. Then the misuse of veto power. Now, veto power was in a way devised to ensure that world peace is maintained. But that entire aspect around veto power has been vitiated, has been perverted, to say the least. When we talk about the veto power, now I just gave you the example of the Rwandan genocide. If at that point of time, France could have taken a much more neutral stance, a humanistic stance, millions of innocent lives could have been saved. When US basically embarked upon a war over Iraq, over weapons of mass destruction which were never to be found, a veto power in UN and the veto vote in the UN, that should have counted. But the US made an absolute disregard of that. As a result of that, what would happen? If tomorrow the other nations cast a veto power against Russia or China, then will those countries follow the suit? No, because the precedents have been set. Now, even the veto power of the P5 nations, that needs to be altered a bit. Rather than requiring a complete majority, you need to have, or a complete agreement over a particular issue, a division of votes and majority opinion should be counted, provided that the Security Council is reformed. Then, instill faith in the system of global governance. And this is where the UN does not only need to be impartial, but needs to be perceived or looked upon as impartial organization. Only then will it be able to maintain its relevance. And how does the UN do that? Ensuring that its global polity and decision making is not driven by the whims and the fantasies of the Western powers or the US government. That is how the rest of the world perceives it to be. It is supposed to uphold the rights of the oppressed. There have been various different instances, for example, in the region of Timor-Leste, in various different areas as well, Angola, in the regions such as Sierra Leone, where the UN peacekeeping force have brought upon the end of conflict, which at one point of time did not seem possible. So, if the UN peacekeeping force is not to be utilized in the modern era of conflict, then what is the purpose of having them? The soldiers earning big bucks and being stationed at some or the other base on deputation and eyeing for a larger role. That is not what the UN peacekeeping force was meant for. So in this article, what is it that we have seen? The need for having the peacekeeping force deployed in the areas of conflict, the UN charters which deal with the requirement of the UN peacekeeping force, the areas where they have been successful, but also the areas where they have been left as a bystander. And why is it that we need a reform in the UN governance structure as soon as possible? So here, let us take a look at the practice question. So without proper reforms, UN stands as an obsolete body, respected by few, feared by none. In light of recent examples, discuss the failures of UN in maintaining world peace and elaborate the reforms required to uphold multilateralism. So this is a statement-based question. So in the introduction, what do you talk about? In the introduction, you talk about the basic background of UN. That United Nations as an international organization came into existence post the debacle of the Second World War to ensure and uphold global peace and the end of the era of conflicts. That's it. That will be the brief introduction. So the background of UN. Okay? Then after that, in the body, what is it that you write? So there, discuss the failures of UN in maintaining the world peace. So here you talk about how and why the UN has been unable to maintain world peace with examples. The Russia-Ukraine example, then the rise of conflict in the region of Middle East time and time again, the warring factions in various different areas leading to civil wars. You talk about those. So here, case studies need to be presented, but briefly so. Okay? You have to remember while writing the answer that this is not a question about Russia-Ukraine war only, or it is not a question only about the Israel-Hamas conflict. Okay? So don't overindulge in these parameters. After that, then you talk about that there is a need to reform the UN as has been voiced by responsible members like India for a long period of time. And this is where you talk about what are the reforms required that we have discussed. In the conclusion, you talk about the fact that in the absence of such reforms, the very basic nature or the purpose of UN is defeated because of the erosion of trust. And the world will be staring at another era and another century of conflict and a complete disarray of global peace. So the need of the hour is to ensure UN remains accountable as well as transparent and responsible. That is how you can provide the conclusion to the answer and gain a good marks. Try writing it yourself and you will realize the nuances required. Having said that, now we move on to the second article. Working towards a meaningful victims register in Bastar. Now, victims register. What is that? So when we talk about Bastar, Now, that is an area of natural beauty and natural abundance in terms of resources, which is almost unparalleled across the rest of the country. But sadly, over the last few decades, Bastar has largely been identified with being one of the fulcrums of left-wing extremism in India. Now, recent encounters and recent action by the central forces and also by the security apparatus has ensured that a lot of these left-wing extremists in the region, they are incapacitated and their overall ability is much reduced. Now, here the article talks about that while we are taking a look at left-wing extremism and taking a view that we should end this left-wing extremism, at the same time, victims register needs to be maintained. And that is a statement which has been made by the Chhattisgarh government. The Home Minister of Chhattisgarh has issued a statement that the government, both at the center and the state, they are collaborating to ensure that the victims register is also maintained, and that is something which is furnished. So before we talk about the need and what the victims register needs to achieve, so first of all, the holistic approach to curb Naxalism which has been adopted by the government, which is yielding results, perceivable results. Obviously, any casualty which happens is actually a blot in our entire security paradigm. But at the same time, you have to understand that India has made quite a substantial amount of progress over the past couple of decades or around 25 years in curbing the menace of left-wing extremism. And this has largely been owing to a holistic measure. Now, when we say holistic measure, what is it and how is it a departure from the previous policies? So earlier, when left-wing extremism used to be talked about, Naxalism, Maoism, all of these are offshoots of left-wing extremism. Now, whenever this used to be talked about, the approach from the side of the government would be to ensure or increase the security oversight or the security in that particular area. More forces would be deployed and killing that last Naxalite would be the aim and would be the goal. The thought process would be that there are a few individuals, if we kill them, we will eliminate the problem of Naxalism once and for all. But that has largely proven to be counterproductive. Why? Because just increasing the number of casualties on the sides of these extremists does not erode the entire thought process or the ideology. These are very highly motivated individuals. So that is why the government for almost past couple of decades has ensured a larger view about how to end that Naxalism. And what is that about? Ensuring that developmental works, the basic developmental works, for example, access to electricity, access to road connectivity in those areas, that is ensured, that is maintained. Because a lack of development, a complete lack of development was something which plagued these areas many decades even after independence. If you are to believe the Naxal ideologues like Khobar Gandhi, who have written their own books associated with that, they talk about the fact that till the 1980s, many tribals in the region of Bastar were not even aware what the color of the Indian flag was. Because that is how much absent the governance and the government structure was from the ground level. No developmental work at all. Now, it is not to say that if you build highways and expressways, the region will never face extremism at all or left-wing extremism at all. But when you provide those developmental works, you provide opportunity for the individuals in that region to witness development, to ensure their own economic participation in the developmental work and the progress that India is making. Those people in these regions, they also get an opportunity to become a part of it. Then, improvement in governance. And when we say governance, provision of services, right? For example, basic healthcare facilities, educational facilities, the proper administrative law and order situation. Now, all these things being completely absent means what? People are left to fend on their own. Now, that is something which cannot be tolerated in the 21st century. So that improvement in governance has happened. With the help of various different programs, greater amount of allocation of funds from the central government, and at the same time, with programs such as aspirational districts, many of these backward regions are witnessing the dawn of development at an unprecedented rate. And that basically, again, the purpose is the same, to ensure participation. Then, ensuring rights of local communities. Now, rights of the local communities, that is one major area of concern and has remained one of the major areas of concern. Because the reservation and the kind of predicament that many people face in that particular part is that the government is a kind of a capitalist mindset, and the government will come, extract all the resources from your area, and then you will be left landless, forestless, resourceless at the mercy of the government. Now, that is never a popular sentiment to have. So that is why rights to the local communities, while that has been ensured with the help of the various different amendments to the constitution and also the extension of the Panchayati Raj Act, the PESA Act, etc. Now that has been ensured, Gram Sabhas have been empowered. But then that right to the local community needs to be much more well entrenched. They need to be provided with certain amount of financial independence as well, which is now being given, and the yields are quite beneficial. Then, public perception management. Not only do you need to do the good work, you need to be seen to be doing the good work as well. So that the propaganda, which is oftentimes spread by these ideologues, the Naxal ideologues, the Maoist ideologues, that propaganda is punctured at the very base. That if the government is doing good, if the government is spending millions and billions in developing a particular area, it needs to be seen doing that. It should not be seen as a kind of an aggrandizer or a kind of an aggressor. So that is where public perception management is also an important role, and obviously developing a holistic security apparatus and ensuring maintenance of peace with more well-trained police officials and more well-trained central police forces, etc., being deployed in the region to improve the level of coordination between the states as well. So a mixture of all these steps, a combination of all these measures has ensured that Naxalism, Maoism, and the entire plethora of various different ideologies which comprises the left-wing extremism as a whole, that is seen to be declining. And that is indeed a fact. But then, there are a lot of people who have suffered, thousands and lakhs of people who have suffered for decades. Families have been lost, villages have been burnt down, and settlements have also disappeared. So that is where there is a need for a victims register. But when we talk about the victims register, now, why is it needed first of all? Rehabilitation for the two kinds of victims. What do we mean by the two kinds of victims? So we also have to be cognizant of the fact that while the extremists did have much amount of impact on the local population, they would exploit the local population, they would kill and maim the local population. So the extremists created their own set of victims. But to get at the extremists and to doubt that the local population is actually in connivance with the extremists, many of the times the authorities have also been seen to be crossing the line. And that is where you had much of the public grievances in many of the areas against the authorities. So regardless of whosoever is committing the atrocity, whether the extremists or in certain cases the authorities, both the victims need to be rehabilitated. And that register will ensure that there's a proper rehabilitation, identification of the people who have lost lives, properties, near and dear ones, that needs to be maintained. Then also accountability. Even in ensuring our security governance is up to terms of the global standards and much better, we need to have accountability for the people who basically have lost a lot of things, and also for the individuals who have perpetrated the crime on the side of the government security apparatus as well. Only then will you have a trust of the local population again. Now, the article also argues that while the people around Bastar region, they are being accommodated in the victims register, there is also a need to rehabilitate and accommodate in that register a lot of tribals, thousands of tribals who participated in the Salwa Judum. Now, Salwa Judum was basically a kind of a local power center which was established in order to fight the Naxals, and this was composed of the tribal population as well. Now, when the Naxals came down hard upon the Salwa Judum people and the cadre belonging to the Salwa Judum group, now the entire group of thousands, they migrated across the entire Dandakaranya region. Now, Dandakaranya region, which is a forested area, spreads across the intervening boundary zones in between Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Now, the article maintains that during the times of the conflict, when the conflict was at its peak in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, at that point of time, you had almost 50,000 plus population who migrated away from the region of Bastar and Odisha into the area of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So they need to be rehabilitated. They need to be brought back into the same fold, and they need to come back to their original land. Otherwise, there will again be a kind of a grievance which will be brewing up. So that is something which should be done to ensure a transparent victims register and the need for it. But when we talk about a way forward, how to ensure that this register is really reliable and solves the purpose? First of all, unbiased list should be maintained. And when unbiased list is talked about, it talks about the fact that it should not be the case that maybe this individual has suffered at the hands of authorities, so that is something which is diluted. No, any suffering needs to be maintained. Agnostic to the nature of perpetrators. So it should not be, the list should not be vitiated by who the perpetrator has been, right? And trust in the local narrative. That is, if a particular individual at a local level, at the village level, if they are saying that they have suffered, you should trust them. It should not be that unless and until I verify that claim, only then will I be able to trust them. Because not all the atrocities are verifiable, but the atrocities remain in the minds as trauma for generations. So that is where the local population, the local citizenry needs to be trusted. And only then will we have a complete rehabilitation. Okay, so in this article, we talked about the holistic approach which has been adopted by the government in order to end the Naxal problem, other than the security paradigm. Then we talked about the need for the victims register. We talked about the various aspects of rehabilitation from the Dandakaranya region as well. Then also how to proceed ahead while maintaining the victims register. Let's take a look at the practice question. Discuss the importance of a victims register in healing conflict-inflicted wounds, taking the example of left-wing extremist impacted areas in India. So basically, in the intro, what do you talk about? Do you straight away start with what is a victims register? One way to approach that can be the direct introduction with what is a victims register, but ideally what should be done is you should talk about that India has suffered immensely over the past few decades due to left-wing extremism in multiple different areas which formed the earlier Red Corridor. Talk about the extension of Red Corridor from the region of West Bengal all the way to Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Karnataka and even Madhya Pradesh, extending even for a brief duration up till Kerala. Now, you can draw a rough map also associated with that, which will make your answer more presentable. Then in the body portion, talk about the fact that while the various different actions by the government against these left-wing extremism has brought down has brought about peace in that area, but for the complete rehabilitation of the population, you need a victims register. Then talk about why it is needed to ensure proper rehabilitation of the population, to ensure proper accountability on the side of the government agencies who have exceeded their mandate and their own governing standards, to ensure that compensation is given to the people who have suffered, to ensure that people who have migrated, they come back to their homelands, and to be perceived as an overall provider of justice. Like that, you can talk about. Okay. Eventually, in conclusion, you write about the fact that this victims register is not only seeking out of justice, but providing an opportunity of fair and equitable life for the future generations in the region. Otherwise, the population will always be left chasing the dream of a modern India. Like that, you can end the answer and fetch good marks. Now coming to the third article, dealing with the Indo-China border dispute. Now, India-China border dispute has been going for almost 4 years now. Ever since the Galwan crisis broke out, the public sentiment across India has been anti-China, to say the least. Now, recent announcement from the side of the government of India, and even followed by the statement from China, that there has been disengagement and an agreement which has been reached between the countries when it comes to various different disputed regions, and to build new patrol areas and buffer zones were to be created. Now, what is that concept of buffer zone? Very briefly, if I'll talk about, let's suppose you consider a particular region. Now, if India is claiming that the land up till here belongs to me, in certain sectors, China is claiming that the land up till here belongs to us. Then India, the other sectors again claims that we have been patrolling up till here. So let's suppose India has been patrolling historically up till here. Now, whenever Chinese would patrol up till this region, there would be rise of conflicts, because China would consider this one as an accepted line. India would consider this one as an accepted line. Again, when the Chinese would come up till this point, and this is particularly in action in the region around the Depsang Plains, right? Even in the region around the Gogra Hot Springs, in all this area, this modus operandi has been followed. Now, when the Chinese would come up till here, there would again be a flashpoint of conflict, because Indians and the Indian patrol points would say that this is our territory. So what has been done as a larger modus vivendi, or a larger method of operation rather, has been that the entire zone has been declared as a buffer zone. An agreement has been arrived at that when can you carry out patrolling. In most of the cases, it is twice every month, and before going for a patrol, you basically announce it to the other party as well that we are coming for a patrol, so that the conflict can be avoided. Now, while this is good news when it comes to the Indo-Chinese relationship, which have been in deep freeze for the past 4 years, owing to the fact that we have a significant amount of potential trade fallout as well, which we have been facing. Many of the companies have been blacklisted and so on. So the trade ties are being impacted. There has been an increased clamor call that you would observe in the trend of news for the past 4 to 5 months, where members of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, they have argued that we need to have Chinese FDI in order to ensure that Make in India is a success, to ensure greater manufacturing output. There have been various voices within the government who have argued for a peace. Now, peace in India and Chinese relationship, they have been transient, to be very modest. Basically, we had a prior event even in Doklam in 2017. Now, you had 2 different retreats by the heads of the state. You had one at Wuhan and one in Tamil Nadu, where Prime Minister of India and Xi Jinping, both of them had a kind of a one-on-one meeting as well. Now, this peace is very important to be maintained. But what this article talks about is the fact is that when we talk about the fact that a peace has been attained at the border, disengagement has been achieved at the border, what do we mean by that? because the narratives, they vary. So from the Chinese side, the narrative has been that we have always been in our territory, we have not crossed our territory. And the argument from the Indian side has been that China has not carried out any incursion within our territory. Our territory is intact and is as sovereign as it ever was. Now, meanwhile, there has been a counter narrative which has been built up that there has been a lot of aggression and lot of various different areas which have now been under Chinese control post the Galwan clash. So that is what the article argues. In order to maintain a long-term peace, you also need to be perceived to basically ensuring and upholding the peace by making it transparent to the larger population about which are the areas where the Chinese did come in and which are the areas where they have been pushed back. What are the buffer zones which have been created in order to understand and in order to assuage the larger public perception that Chinese have basically occupied some of the territory. And the article argues that the entire parliament needs to be taken into confidence before any such agreement is made. Okay? So here by this article, the aspect of transparency, ensuring that the entire country is kept in loop in terms of talking about what needs to be done and where is it that disengagement has happened to maintain and uphold the public trust. Okay? Then, the job crisis undermines the state legitimacy. This is the fourth article. This deals with the ongoing and the existent job crisis, which is present not only in India, but across the globe. Across the world, be it developed nations, the developing nations, underdeveloped nations, all of them, they face the same problem of creating enough number of quality jobs. So when we say quality jobs, what do we mean by that? So where you have a dignified life, where you get a respectable compensation, and where your labor is also respected. So that quality job, they are not present in bulk anywhere across the world. But the article then goes on to focus upon the Indian situation. That unless and until we improve this particular issue, then people's faith in our system of governance, people's faith in the model of democracy, that will be eroding. Now, when we say that people's faith in the system of governance will erode, why? If you don't have jobs, will the legitimacy of the state government, of the national or the central government in this particular case completely go away? So that is where the article argues that, look, any individual, when you talk about the individual's role in a society, after all, we humans, we are social organisms. We don't live in isolation. We live in a society. So any individual's social contribution or the role in society is something which is always linked to multiple other factors. You have individuals' contribution to the society, right? As a part of the larger society, the individual makes certain contributions and social contracts. Then the individual's own basic dignity, right to dignified life, ensures that there is some amount of respectability within the society. And that dignity is oftentimes associated with financial heft. You would have seen it in your life as well. People who are well off, they are respected much more in the society. And people who are not so well-to-do financially, they are on the receiving end of the spectrum. Isn't it? So basically, within the society, the individual is losing their own status. That is the argument. And it is basically seen that people who are well-to-do, financially rich, those set of population, they have an increased say in decision making. They voice their opinion in terms of social issues and social matter. So they are socially a part of much more integrated to the society, whereas these individuals who are jobless, who don't have meaningful employment, they are being left off. So that is where the problem arises. while we talk about a demographic dividend, but a lack of jobs will create frustration amongst the youthful population, which will be very difficult for any government to handle. And the article argues that long-term solution to this particular problem is still not being talked about. Political parties, they go for a kind of a hobnobbing where someone blames the other one blames the first one, that this is why the jobs are not created, this is why the jobs are not created. But the structural reforms required at the grassroots level to be able to create more jobs, that is something which is not being provided. So here, there is a twofold problem that has been pointed out. Sense of dignity and purpose of an individual to be a part of the societal discourse. Now, this is largely being limited to financial wealth. Limited to financial wealth. Okay? Now, an individual also needs to be seen as providing financial support not only for themselves but people around them. Again, with the lack of respectable job, that is also being lost. Now, there have been arguments which have been made for almost a decade now about provision of universal basic income. You would also have heard about it. What is that universal basic income? The concept of UBI. The universal basic income means that even if you don't have a job, the government will provide you with a basic income level. Now that is being seen as a kind of a panacea or a final solution in terms of creating that demand in the economy and creating that final push in the growth of the economy and the people to be living a dignified life. But the article goes ahead and argues that, look, even if you provide that universal basic income, it is laced with problems. For example, if an individual, let's suppose, is gaining that income, is receiving that income, means already you have the case where the society is divided. Society is divided between the givers and the receivers. Very few top population of the society, around 5% or 10%, the ones who are doing well, they will be giving the taxes, the taxpayers, and the taxpayers basically will be supporting the income which is provided to the people who are not earning. Not only will it create a kind of a disillusionment for the taxpayers against the government, that why are we paying tax? If all that money has to be distributed to the other population, what is the government doing to us? So there will be a complete issue associated with that also. But the people who are receiving that in itself will mean a loss of dignity. There's also a problem of financial feasibility. How many people will you be able to provide that income to? While you have the increased culture of freebies which is being discussed in the court also, that whether the government should provide freebies or not, you look around every other state making an announcement of 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 being distributed to the population. Now that in itself has got a potential to put the state's financial and finances at an absolute risk, meaning long-term damages. But to be able to provide a universal basic income will mean a very large dent in terms of our fiscal consolidation. And then the article also argues that it is a basic assault on human dignity. You have divided the society and the receivers will never feel empowered. Then, danger on the relevance of a larger population. So basically the society, when it has large number of population who are receiving the welfare, their contribution is seen to be very less. The contributions are there, but it is seen to be less. That is when that population is subject to various different types of inequality, various different types of discrimination, and oftentimes the result is very, very negative. That is a demographic disaster that we need to be worried about. So universal basic income is not a solution. So what is the way forward? So that is where the article basically argues that one has to address the structural issues and thereby creating more jobs. The creation of more jobs and quality jobs need to be the aim of the governance standards. Okay, so creation of quality jobs. Of quality jobs. Not playing party politics. That is, when we'll come to power, we'll create these many jobs. How will you create those jobs? When we are in power, we have created. How have you created jobs and what is the way to achieve that? So, moving away from party politics. Away from party politics. That is what the article argues. Okay, so these are basically some of the measures which have been argued that structural reforms are required in the way we talk about the job creation, because when we talk about the structural reforms, you see that presently the approach of the governments have been creative destruction. That is, there will be destruction of the old modes of production and newer systems, newer factories, newer industries will come up. So there will be better jobs, better quality of life, etc. But that destruction of the older industry in the age of AI means the newer and the modern industries, they have a capacity to absorb at least the same amount of labor, and in many cases they can do with lesser amount of labor as well. Gone are those days where you could have 5,000 people working at the factory floor at the same time in a particular area, and you can have hundreds of such industries. So you need to find modern way and a much more creative way to have more job creators rather than job seekers. And we have discussed this time and again. This will come with skill improvement, upskilling, reskilling of the population, vocational education to be provided to the population as well. What are the other measures that you feel as future administrators, as future bureaucrats, that you can bring into place in order to ensure more jobs are created? Put that in the comment section below. Okay, now we move on to the next article. That is, why are big tech companies such as Google scouting for nuclear power? Now, what is the context of this? The context is that on October 14th, Google announced the first corporate agreement to buy nuclear power from small modular reactors, and this will be developed by the Kairos Power. Now, this is something which will be commissioned by 2030, and the deployments of the nuclear power will continue up till 2035. And it is expected that this deal will add 500 megawatt of nuclear power to the US grid. Now, the small modular reactors, first of all, that is also important for your exam. So what are these small modular reactors? So you see, when we talk about nuclear reactors, they are of different kinds based upon the amount of energy that they produce. You have the large conventional reactors of 700 plus megawatts. Now, that is something which is used to power cities, right? Something which is used to provide energy to the grids. Then you have micro reactors, very, very small, for small utilities in certain parts of urban areas or in very smaller designated utilization. Then even sometimes in when we talk about submarines, there also you have the micro reactors, right? When we talk about, and in today's discussion itself, we will talk about Arihant, Aradhaman. Now all of them have the miniaturized reactor. Now they are able to produce somewhere around 83 megawatt energy, and that much, around 100 megawatts. Now that is something required for, let's suppose, a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, a nuclear powered submarine. So that is the utility of these micro reactors. In between these two extremes lies the small modular reactors up to 3 megawatts energy. Now, these small modular reactors, they are advanced nuclear reactors that have a power capacity up to 300 megawatts, which is about 1/3 of the larger reactors. They are small, physically small, modular, basically designed for a particular set of application, and they harness nuclear fission to produce energy. Now, why is it that the tech companies like Google, Apple, all of them, Amazon, they are basically linking deals left, right, and center for the production of energy and utilization of energy from such nuclear reactors? You also have the article talking about the fact that you had Microsoft signed a 20-year power purchase agreement where the 3-mile reactor, the 3-mile island reactor in US is to be again commissioned. Remember, 3-mile island in US is where you had the nuclear materials which leaked out, creating the worst industrial disaster that US has ever faced. So there has been a rush by the various different tech companies. Why? You see, in the age of AI, in the age of supercomputers, and in the era of cognitive learning by these machines, there is a greater utilization of electrical energy as well. And as and when there is a greater utilization of the electrical energy, means what? That you will also require the greater utilization or the production of electrical energy. Google in itself, in a statement made last year, said that its carbon emissions in 2023, when we talk about Google, then the carbon emissions in 2023 rose up by 13% year on year. That is, as compared to 2022, it rose up 13%. And as and when AI becomes much more a norm and much more wider in terms of its application and its use, the consumption of energy is going to increase in the coming days. So as the energy consumption is going to increase, so as a result of that, where is that energy going to be provided from? Now, solar energy has got its own set of limitations, right? Owing to the weather changes, adverse weather conditions, the time of the night, it has got limited amount of application. Now, these supercomputers and the energy hubs and the cloud systems of the AI, they will be operative in the 24-hour period rather than only during the daytime. So that poses a sort of problem. That is where these nuclear reactors are being seen as a way out. This is seen to be a kind of a carbon emission-free energy which can support these powerhouses. So all the tech companies that you thought of, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, now when we think about it, we think that how can these companies create emissions? But they will be one of the larger emitters in the coming age because the energy consumption will be so high. Now, there have been various doubts raised against the utilization of the nuclear energy, where activists have said that is nuclear energy really clean? We have had accidents in the region in Chernobyl in the 1980s, 3-Mile Island in US. There have been nuclear disasters where it has been indicated that human error can lead to a larger fallout and radioactive waste can spread over a larger distance. But also, in case of Fukushima disaster in Japan, it is indicative of the fact that even let's suppose human error is not there, natural disasters like tsunami can basically lead to a greater radioactive waste as well. So there are dangers associated with nuclear power. But in the present day and age, it is still being seen as a kind of a clean energy. The US government has been supporting that as well. And that is one of the way forward that the various companies need to adopt going ahead for the consumption of the energy. And in the age of AI, that energy is going to increase. So overall, why is it that Google, Microsoft, etc. are basically seeking out nuclear reactor energy? Because their energy consumption has increased. Why has it increased? Because of AI. Why because of AI? Because the system and the machine learning needs to continue throughout the 24-hour period. Okay? That is what you have to understand. Now, few of the articles relevant for your prelims. IMF retains India's growth projection at 7% for FY25 and at around 6.5% for FY25-26. Now, the IMF has said that basically the pent-up demand during the COVID era that had created a growth of around 8.5% in 2023, that demand has now been absorbed. Now, the growth of Indian economy is going to match with the economy's capacity. There is no pent-up demand left anymore. So that is where India is slated to grow at 7%. And going ahead, it will come down as the economy across the globe that matures. The IMF basically has published a report that is relevant for your prelims. So IMF has published the World Economic Outlook. Economic Outlook. Okay. Now that report has been important. You can maintain this particular list of the various organizations and the reports that they have come out with and the reports that they have maintained. Now, the IMF has indicated that the global growth is going to come back and the inflationary trends which were present across the globe. There are certain pressures as well due to the commodity availability because of the crisis, the wars in the region of Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East. There is going to be some supply chain shock, but across the globe, the growth outcome has been positive for the coming years, owing to the fact that there have been multiple different steps taken by the governments and the central banks across the world in terms of monetary tightening. Now, the IMF has also prescribed 3 steps in order to ensure that the growth is maintained in the coming years. First is the stance of monetary neutrality. That is, neither going for fiscal easing, where you suddenly increase the money supply to boost the growth, but that will also fuel inflation, nor going for excess tightening of the fiscal space, where money supply in itself disappears, so the growth will plummet. So, maintenance of fiscal neutrality stance. That is one. Then, second is ensure structural reforms are taken to maintain the demand and the requirement of the aging as well as the youthful population. And also build fiscal buffers, right? Like forex reserve buffers, etc., that we are building up in order to face that external shocks. So these are some of the steps that have been projected by the IMF. Now, 3 scientists discovered new genus of the jumping spiders Tenkana in South India. Now, Tenkana basically refers to a species, a variety of the jumping spiders. Now, a new variety has been discovered in the region of Karnataka, and that has been named as Tenkana Jayamangli. Now, this has been named after the river or the stream Jayamangli in the region of Karnataka. Now, the word Tenkana in itself means something belonging to the south. So, you basically have Tenkana. There are 2 varieties of already existent jumping spiders. That is the presence of Tenkana Manu and Tenkana Arkavati. They are also already present in the region of southern India and also in the parts of Sri Lanka. This is a new variety and a new species of arachnid which has been discovered. India's 4th nuclear submarine launched with advanced arms. So, in the Arihant class of submarines, you would have recently come across the news story where INS Arighat, the second one, had been commissioned. Now this talks about, so basically you had S2, which was INS Arihant. Then you had S3, which basically was INS Arighat. Both of them have been commissioned. And then you have S4, which is slated to be named as INS Aridhaman. Now this is supposed to be much larger as compared to the earlier two. It is the entire details obviously are not available to the outside world. Now it has been launched for the water trials, the sea trials. So when you initially construct the outer hull of the submarine, then you push it or you put it in water to ensure that there is a structural integrity which is maintained and to carry out certain system checks. After that, putting it into the sea, after that phase has been successful, then there are other fittings and the internal furnishings provided in the submarine, and then the final commissioning takes place generally a year and a half later on. So this INS Aridhaman is slated to be commissioned by 2025. This will add significant heft to our nuclear submarine forces, which are in dire need for an expansion. Now this will help us protect our borders, and this will have a larger size, larger displacement, a more stronger nuclear reactor, much more indigenous components. And also earlier when we talk about the INS Arihant and Arighat, they are deployed with the K-15 or the Sagarika class missiles. Now this K-15 or the Sagarika class, they basically have a range of almost 750 kilometers. They can be launched from submarine platforms. Now, Aridhaman will have K-15, but at the same time, it will also be having a much larger K-4 missiles. Now, these K-4 missiles have a standoff range of almost 3,000 kilometers, making it much more lethal. This has 750 kilometer range. And this is something which will provide us greater deterrence. Going ahead, there will be repeat orders of this particular class of submarine as well, and that is something which bodes well for our nuclear submarine force. It is being built in Visakhapatnam, and the Shipbuilding Center SBC at Visakhapatnam is where it is being built in utmost secrecy. Okay. Now, India and Singapore to explore joint development, production and of equipment for the armed forces. So marking a decade of the relationship or the decade of our Act East policy, India and Singapore, they have been seeking to elevate the level of cooperation. Now, this was marked by the Prime Minister's visit to Singapore as well, where the bilateral relationship had been elevated to comprehensive strategic partnership. Now, at the same time, while the relationship hinges on people-to-people contact, trade relationship, etc., both the countries have realized that the armed forces, the equipments that they require, not in terms of larger howitzers, etc., but when it comes to small arms, for example, their technology sharing and co-production can be done, which will be beneficial for both the countries as well as can be utilized for the export market. So this is something to further deepen our Act East policy, increase the relationship with the ASEAN nations and improve the overall production and trade as well. Now, the last article of the day. Steel import curbs to dent MSME's ability to compete. Now you see, the government has been imposing certain amount of curbs and restrictions on the import in the form of import duties. Now it is being done to protect the local steel industry. When we talk about the local steel industry, they are producing steel which is much more costlier as compared to the steel being imported from countries like China, Japan and Vietnam. And that is owing to the fact that there has never been such an increase in our domestic steel supply. And over the ages, if you consider the past 20-30 years, there has been a protectionist policy provided to our own Indian steel makers. Imports have not been allowed to such an extent other than a brief period where the Chinese steel flooded Indian markets. But we need to develop our own steel production quite significantly. In the past year itself, the import of steel from, for example, Japan has risen by a massive 130%. If you consider the import from Japan, increased by 130%, from Vietnam by more than 50%, by China, from China by more than 31%. Now, this is because our overall steel production year on year, that has increased by a meager 5%. Understand this. Steel production year on year has increased by 5%. But the demand for steel in the local market has increased by 13%. So where do you get the rest of the steel? That is where the companies, they end up importing them. Because for various different infrastructure requirements, for various different machinery requirement, capital good manufacturing, everything, you need the availability of steel. Where do you get that steel from? So that is where the demand is outpacing the supply. So what happens? Import is happening at a much cheaper price because the Indian steel is much costlier. So that is where it is said, the article argues, and basically certain trade bodies, they have argued that don't curb the import of the steel because that will harm the MSMEs in terms of their competitiveness to produce the low-cost goods. Otherwise, their goods will be costly and will be not competitive in the global market. But on the other side, you have to understand that it is a high time that Indian steel makers up their game. They produce a larger quantity, not only for utilization in the domestic market, but also international market. If you have more demand and the demand in Indian economy in itself is not being filled, you can imagine there's a lot of scope for improvement. And when the steel sector grows, historically, the civilizations and the nations have grown at a much greater pace. So the steel sector needs to come out of the protective shell and needs to take the baton for growth. That marks the end of the discussion for today. I hope the discussion has been positive and has added some amount of content to your existing information. If you have liked the discussion, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button and put the comment in the comment section below, along with the fact that I expect you to put the comment even with regards to what comprises as the steps which could be taken to create quality jobs in our country. Now, after this, I suggest you to go to the Telegram channel, Telegram page and attempt the multiple choice questions there. We meet again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.